The snow had buried the road hours ago. Serafina no longer felt her fingers, and the child inside her had grown still in a way that terrified her more than the cold ever could. Each step drove agony through her swollen belly, contractions coming in waves that threatened to drop her to her knees. But she kept walking because stopping meant dying, and dying meant her daughter would never draw breath. The trees rose around her like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with white. Frost clung to her eyelashes, turning the world to a blur of shadow and pale light. She could no longer feel her wolf, that familiar warmth at the back of her consciousness that had sustained her through 8 years of loveless marriage. The pregnancy had weakened her, and the cold had done the rest. Garrett's face swam before her in the swirling snow, the way his lip had curled when he'd shoved her from the carriage. "The prophecy has doomed us both," he'd said. "I won't let that creature destroy everything I've built." She remembered her own voice, raw with desperation, begging him to reconsider. She remembered his answer. "You can give the child to the temple and return to my house, or you can die in this storm with it. Choose." She had chosen. Not death, never death, but she had chosen to walk into the white oblivion rather than hand her baby to strangers who would never love her. If they were going to die, they would die together, mother and child. And perhaps in the next life, they would find the warmth this one had denied them. A fallen oak loomed ahead, its massive trunk split by lightning sometime in the distant past. A hollow gaped beneath its roots, barely large enough for a woman to crawl inside. Serafina fell to her knees before it, snow soaking through the thin wool of her cloak. Her hands found the frozen earth, scraped away enough debris to widen the entrance, and she dragged herself inside. The space smelled of rot and cold earth, but it blocked the wind. She curled around her belly, trying to give the child whatever warmth remained in her failing body. Her breath came in shallow gasps that fogged in the darkness. She thought of her mother, dead these 15 years, and wondered if she was waiting somewhere beyond the veil. The child shifted inside her. Still alive, still fighting. Serafina pressed her palm against the movement and made a promise she had no way of keeping. "I will not let you go, little one. Whatever comes, I will not let you go." The storm howled on, indifferent to promises. Ronan Ashford had ridden this border for 20 years, and he knew when the forest was trying to tell him something. His patrol should have turned back an hour ago, the storm worsening with every passing minute. But something kept him pressing forward. A feeling, an instinct his wolf could not articulate but refused to ignore. His men grumbled behind him, their horses struggling through drifts that reached their knees. Young Theron called out over the wind, asking if they might shelter until the worst had passed. Ronan was about to agree when Marcus, their best tracker, pulled up short. "Blood on the wind," Marcus said. "And something else. Wolf, but strange, weakened." Ronan turned his mount, following Marcus's pointed direction. They found the trail half buried by fresh snowfall, footprints too small for a man, spaced with the irregularity of exhaustion or injury. He dismounted and followed on foot, his men spreading out behind him with torches raised against the growing dark. The hollow beneath the fallen oak looked like a grave. Ronan's heart clenched as he crouched before it, expecting to find a corpse. Instead, he found a woman, young and golden-haired, her face deathly pale but her eyes flickering open at his approach. She was pregnant. Gods above, she was heavily pregnant and half frozen to death. She tried to fight him when he reached for her. Her struggles were weak, pathetic really, but they spoke of a will that refused to surrender even now. Ronan kept his voice gentle, the same tone he'd used with wounded animals and frightened children. "Easy, girl. We're not here to hurt you. We're the Alpha King's patrol. You're safe." Safe. She repeated the word like she'd forgotten its meaning. "The baby." "You can't have the baby. No one wants your baby. he said. "We want to get you warm before you both freeze." Something in his voice must have reached her because she stopped struggling. Her eyes, violet and striking, even clouded with pain, searched his face. Then she went limp in his arms, consciousness finally abandoning her. Ronan carried her to his horse and mounted with her cradled against his chest. "The child," he told his men. "The child has to live. Ride like the wind itself is chasing you." They rode. Castle Blackwood rose from the mountainside like a fist of black stone thrust toward the heavens. Its fires burned bright against the storm, visible for miles, a beacon for lost travelers and a warning to enemies. The guards at the gate barely had time to shout before Ronan's patrol thundered through, snow spraying from their horses' hooves. The great hall fell silent as Ronan burst through the doors, the half-frozen woman still unconscious in his arms. A war council had been in session, maps spread across the central table, Alpha King Magnus standing at its head with his commanders arrayed around him. Every eye turned toward the intrusion. Magnus straightened slowly, his amber gaze taking in the scene. His face betrayed nothing, carved from the same stone as his castle, but something shifted behind those cold eyes when he saw the woman, the swollen belly visible beneath her cloak, the ice crystals in her golden hair. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had learned never to reveal weakness. "Found her at the border," Ronan said, "dying in the snow. She's pregnant. Near her time, I think." Magnus moved before he consciously decided to, crossing the hall in long strides that ate the distance between them. He reached out, and Ronan carefully transferred the woman to his king's arms. She weighed almost nothing, light as a bundle of kindling, her skin like ice where it touched his bare hands. He told himself it was concern for any helpless creature that drove him. He told himself it was the pragmatic worry of a king who could not afford to let people die on his borders. He told himself many things as he carried her toward the healing wing, none of them the truth. Maren met them at the door, the old healer already prepared by some runner who had raced ahead. Her sharp eyes assessed the situation in an instant. "Hypothermia," she said. Contractions started. "This will be close. Get her on the bed and get out, all of you." Magnus laid the woman down as gently as he could manage. Her eyes fluttered open again, just for a moment, and she looked at him without recognition or fear. Just exhaustion. Just the simple acceptance of someone who had given up expecting cruelty and could no longer be surprised by kindness. "She'll live," he said to Maren. It was not a question. The healer met his eyes. "If the gods will it, and her body is stronger than it looks." Magnus stationed himself in the corridor outside. He told himself he would leave as soon as he knew the outcome. He stayed through the night, pacing like a caged wolf, leaving only when Ronan physically dragged him to bed as dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains. The woman lived. The baby stayed inside her, not quite ready to enter the world. Maren declared it a minor miracle. Magnus dreamed of violet eyes and did not understand why. 3 days passed before Seraphina woke fully, her mind clear and her body finally warm. She came to consciousness slowly, awareness returning in fragments. Soft furs beneath her, a fire crackling somewhere nearby, the smell of herbs, medicinal and green, and her belly, still round, still heavy. The baby shifting with what felt like irritation at having been disturbed. She tried to sit up, and a gentle hand pressed her back down. "Slowly, child. You've been through an ordeal." The woman beside her bed was old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing the simple robes of a healer. She had a kind face, the sort that had seen enough suffering to develop genuine compassion, rather than the performed sympathy Seraphina was used to receiving. "Where am I?" Seraphina asked. Her voice came out rough, raw from disuse. "Castle Blackwood." The healer handed her a cup of water, helped her drink. Guest of the Alpha King himself, if you can believe it. He's been asking after you. The Alpha King. Magnus the Merciless, they called him in Thornwood. The monster who had executed his own blood, razed villages, made widows by the hundreds. Seraphina's heart began to race, and the healer must have sensed it because she patted Seraphina's hand. Hush now. Whatever stories you've heard, you're safe here. I've known that boy since he was in swaddling clothes, and he's never harmed a woman or child in his life. The villages he burned were harboring men who slaughtered innocents. The cousin he executed had tried to murder him in his sleep. Stories grow in the telling. Seraphina wanted to believe her. She was too tired not to. The Alpha King came to see her that afternoon. She heard him before she saw him, heavy footsteps in the corridor. And then he filled the doorway like a shadow-given form. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered and powerful, with black hair that fell past his collar and eyes of amber that seemed to see through every defense she'd ever built. A scar cut across his face from temple to jaw, white against his tanned skin, and he moved with the contained violence of a predator barely leashed. He stopped at the threshold. His expression revealed nothing. "You're awake," he said. "Yes." Her voice sounded small. She hated that. He entered the room but kept his distance, settling into a chair by the window rather than looming over her bed. The afternoon light caught the scar, and she noticed for the first time that his hands bore the calluses of a man who worked with weapons, not just delegated their use. "What is your name?" he asked. "Seraphina. Seraphina Vale, once of House Vale, though the house no longer exists. Your pack." She hesitated. "Thornwood. By marriage." His eyes flickered at the name, something passing through them too quickly to read. "And your husband." The word stuck in her throat. "My husband left me to die in that storm." Silence stretched between them. She expected questions, demands for explanation, perhaps accusations of lying. Instead, Magnus simply nodded once. "You'll stay here until you're well," he said. "After that, we can discuss options. You won't be forced to return anywhere you don't wish to go." He rose to leave, and she called after him before she could stop herself. "Why?" He paused at the door. "Why what? Why help me? Why care what happens to a stranger found frozen at your border?" Magnus was silent for a long moment. Then, without turning around, he answered, "Because someone should." He left. A servant arrived minutes later with a tray of soup and fresh bread, and Seraphina ate until her stomach ached with the unfamiliar sensation of fullness. The week that followed taught her that monsters were not always what the stories claimed. She watched Magnus from her window as he trained with his men in the courtyard below, brutal and demanding, accepting nothing less than perfection. She saw him berate a guard who offered excuses instead of taking responsibility for a failed assignment, his voice sharp enough to cut stone. She understood why men called him merciless, but she also saw him kneel in the snow to speak to a servant's daughter who had wandered too far from the kitchens and become lost. She watched him carry the child back to her frantic mother with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that had taken so many lives. She noticed how the servant smiled when he passed, not the fearful deference she expected, but something warmer, almost fond. Marin told her about Elena, the first queen, dead these 5 years, killed in Magnus's arms during a border war. Enemies had known that hurting her would destroy him, and they had been right. "He has not been the same since," Marin said. "Built walls around himself so high that no one can reach him. Convinced himself that caring is weakness. But the man he was before, the man Elena loved, he's still in there somewhere, just buried deep." Seraphina found the East Wing by accident, wandering the castle corridors when she grew restless. The doors were locked, the hallway thick with dust, and when she asked a passing servant why, the woman paled and scurried away without answering. She was standing there, studying those locked doors, when she heard footsteps behind her. Magnus stood at the corridor's end, frozen in place, his face a mask of something that might have been pain if she hadn't known better. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then his expression hardened into something closer to anger, and he turned and walked away without a word. That night, she found a book outside her chamber door, a worn volume of poetry, the leather soft from years of handling. Inside the cover, in a woman's delicate hand, someone had written, "For Magnus, who sees beauty where others see only words. Love always, E." Serafina held the book to her chest and understood that she was not the only one in this castle who had been broken by loss. The library became their meeting place, though neither of them had planned it that way. She went there seeking distraction from the restless child who seemed determined to keep her awake, and found Magnus already there, reading by the light of a dying fire. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment she saw surprise cross his features. "I should go," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude." He gestured to the chair across from him. "It's a library, not a throne room. Sit if you wish." She sat. They read in silence for perhaps an hour, the only sounds the crackle of flames and the occasional turn of a page. It should have been awkward. Instead, it felt like the first peace she had known in years. "What are you reading?" she asked eventually. He showed her the cover. A history of the Eastern campaigns, dry as dust, but his mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I'm told it cures sleeplessness. Is it working?" "Remarkably well. I've nodded off twice in the past chapter." She laughed before she could stop herself, and his almost smile became something closer to the real thing. They talked then, carefully at first, about books they had loved as children and stories that had shaped them. He told her that Elena had read to him in this room, that he had not entered it since her death. She told him that Garrett had mocked her love of reading, called it pretension from a woman who should focus on more practical matters. "Your husband," Magnus said slowly, "sounds like a fool." "He is," Serafina agreed. "Among other things." The fire had burned down to embers when she finally rose to leave. At the door, she turned back. "Thank you," she said. "For the library, for the shelter, for not asking more than I'm ready to give." He watched her go, and the expression on his face was one she could not read, though she thought about it long into the night. The formal dinner was Cordelia's doing. The Dowager Queen had returned to court 3 days prior, drawn by rumors of the pregnant stranger in her son's care, and she had opinions about how such situations should be handled. Chief among them was that Serafina should be seen, should be acknowledged, should be given a position that protected her from the whispers that followed her through the castle corridors. Serafina dressed in borrowed finery, a cream-colored gown that accommodated her belly, and took her place at the long table among ambassadors and nobles who barely bothered to hide their curiosity. She kept her eyes on her plate, ate little, spoke less, and tried to ignore the weight of speculation that pressed against her from every direction. Magnus sat at the head of the table, entertaining his guests with the cold civility that seemed to be his default when dealing with politics. Cordelia presided at the opposite end, her silver hair gleaming in the candlelight, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Between them, the dinner progressed through courses of venison and winter vegetables, accompanied by wine that flowed freely from servants' pitchers. Serafina smelled the poison before she saw it poured. The wolfsbane was subtle, masked beneath the wine's natural bouquet, but her mother had taught her herbs before she could read, and some lessons never faded. She recognized the faint bitter undertone, the hint of something green and wrong beneath the red. The servant approached Magnus with a fresh cup. Serafina did not think. She acted, surging from her chair with a speed that belied her pregnant belly, crossing the distance between them just as Magnus lifted the cup to his lips. Her hand struck the silver, sending wine splashing across the white tablecloth in a purple stain that spread like blood. The cup clattered to the floor. Every eye in the hall turned toward her. Magnus's hand closed around her wrist, not hurting but stabilizing. His expression was unreadable. "Explain yourself." "Wolfsbane." Her voice carried through the silence. "In the wine, I'm certain of it." A heartbeat of stillness. Then chaos erupted as guards drew weapons, guests cried out, and the servant who had poured the wine attempted to flee. She was caught at the doors, dragged back, her face a mask of terror that told Seraphina everything she needed to know. Marin arrived to test the wine. The old healer's face went gray as she confirmed what Seraphina already knew. "Enough to kill within the hour," she said. "Slow acting. He would have been dead before midnight." Magnus released Seraphina's wrist. His eyes never left her face. "How did you know?" he asked later, when the guests had been dismissed and the assassin taken to the dungeons for questioning. They stood in his private study, firelight casting long shadows across maps and documents, and Seraphina told him the truth. "My mother was a healer before she married my father. She taught me everything she knew, herbs and poisons and remedies for ailments no proper noblewoman should discuss. Garrett called it worthless, said I should focus on the duties of a mate, not play at being a midwife." Magnus was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, and his words were not what she expected. "My healer is old. Her hands are less steady than they were, and she has no apprentice. The castle needs someone with her skills to carry on the work when she can no longer do it." Seraphina's breath caught. "You're offering me a position, not charity. Paid work, a title, a place in my household that no one can question." She could refuse. He had offered her safe passage to her father's lands once before, and that offer still stood. She could leave, could build a life somewhere far from the memories of Garrett and the fear of what might follow her. She said yes. They negotiated terms like equals, something she had never experienced with a man before. She set conditions, he agreed to some and countered others, and they found middle ground with a civility that bordered on warmth. When she signed the contract, ink staining her fingers, she felt something shift in her chest. Not just security, purpose. Cordelia lingered by the door as Seraphina prepared to leave. The Dowager Queen studied her with eyes that missed nothing, and then she smiled. "You'll do, girl," she said. "You'll do." Winter deepened its grip on the mountains, but inside Castle Blackwood, something warmer was growing. Seraphina settled into her role as assistant healer with an ease that surprised everyone, perhaps most of all herself. Marin welcomed her not as competition but as relief, glad to share the burden of caring for a castle full of guards and servants and nobles who seemed determined to injure themselves in creative ways. Her first real test came 3 days after she signed the contract. A young kitchen maid had burned her arm badly on a cooking fire, the skin blistered and weeping, and Marin was occupied with a guardsman who had broken his leg during training. Seraphina took charge without hesitation, cleaning the wound with gentle hands, applying a poultice of comfrey and honey that her mother had taught her to make, wrapping the arm in clean linen while speaking softly to the terrified girl. "It will scar," she told the maid honestly, "but it will heal clean, and the pain will fade within the week. Come back tomorrow and I'll change the dressing." The maid left with tears of gratitude rather than pain, and Marin, watching from across the room, nodded once with approval. "You'll do fine," the old healer said. "Better than fine." The patients responded to Seraphina's calm presence, her gentle hands, her willingness to listen as well as treat. She found herself sought out not just for physical ailments, but for the quieter wounds that plagued the heart, and she learned that a castle's healer was as much confessor as physician. The servants told her things they would never tell their masters, small fears and large hopes, the petty dramas of castle life that somehow seemed less petty when spoken aloud to someone who listened without judgment. Magnus sought her out in the inner gardens on an afternoon, when pale winter sunlight managed to break through the clouds. Steam rose from the hot springs that warmed this sheltered space, coaxing winter-blooming flowers into unlikely life, and Seraphina had come to sit among them and give her aching back a respite from standing. He looked troubled. She had learned to read his expressions over the weeks, the subtle shifts in his carefully controlled face that betrayed what his words never would. Something was weighing on him, something he did not know how to articulate. She waited. He would tell her, or he would not, and pressing would only make him retreat. "My wolf," he said finally. "He has been restless since Elena's death. Difficult to control. I manage, but lately, it has worsened." He pushed closer to the surface without warning. "I don't understand why." Seraphina considered this. "Have you spoken to Marin about it?" Marin has no answers. No one does. He sat beside her on the stone bench, keeping a careful distance between them. "I thought perhaps, with your knowledge of herbs, you might have heard of something that could help." She shook her head slowly. "I know treatments for physical ailments of the wolf, but what you're describing sounds like something else. A spiritual restlessness, perhaps. An emotional one." As she spoke, something shifted in his eyes. The amber darkened, flashed with gold, and his voice deepened to a register that made her skin prickle with awareness. The wolf, rising without permission, without warning, exactly as he had described. She should have been afraid. Garrett's wolf had terrified her, all teeth and hunger and barely leashed violence, but Magnus's wolf felt different. Dangerous, yes, but not threatening. Not to her. She spoke directly to it, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Peace. I see you. I'm not afraid." The gold flickered, faded. Magnus drew a sharp breath, and when he looked at her again, his eyes were amber once more. "That's never worked before," he said. His voice was rough. "No one has been able to calm him since Elena died." Seraphina had no explanation to offer. She only knew that something had passed between them in that moment, something neither of them fully understood. The steam rose around them like a veil, separating this moment from the rest of the world, and she felt the baby shift inside her as if responding to the tension in the air. "Your child," Magnus said, his eyes dropping to her belly. "Does it fear me?" "No." She placed her hand over the movement. "I think she was just reminding me she's still here." "She?" Seraphina smiled. "A feeling I have. Marin thinks I'm being fanciful, but I've known since the beginning." Magnus was silent for a long moment. Then, tentatively, as if afraid the gesture might be rejected, he reached out. "May I?" She took his hand and placed it where the baby was kicking. The look on his face when he felt the movement was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Wonder and grief and hope all tangled together in an expression that stripped away every wall he had built. "I don't know what you are to me," Magnus said quietly. The words seemed torn from him against his will. She met his eyes. "I don't either, but I'm not running." They sat together in the garden until the sun began to set. Not touching, not speaking, but present with each other in a way that felt more intimate than any embrace. The delegation from Thornwood arrived on a gray morning when snow threatened but had not yet fallen. Seraphina heard the commotion from the healing wing, the shouts of guards and the thunder of hooves in the courtyard, and her heart began to race before her mind caught up. She knew those colors, that banner, that voice raised in greeting, smooth and charming and utterly false. Garrett had come. She stayed hidden as Ronan had instructed, watching from the gallery above the great hall as her husband strode in like a conquering hero. He had dressed for the occasion, finery that spoke of wealth and status, his sandy hair perfectly arranged and his smile practiced to perfection. He played the grieving mate to an audience of nobles and guards who had never learned to see through his mask. "My beloved wife," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "Lost in madness during her pregnancy, fled into that terrible storm. I have searched everywhere, suffered greatly, feared her dead. And now I learn she has been here, sheltered by the great Alpha King himself. I come only to be reunited with my family. He had witnesses. Men from his pack who swore they had seen Seraphina flee of her own will, who testified to Garrett's desperate search through the snow. He had documents suggesting instability, a healer's report claiming pregnancy madness. He had built his case carefully, and Seraphina felt her hope crumbling as she watched. Magnus's face revealed nothing. He listened to Garrett's performance with the cold patience of a king who had heard many lies in his time, and when the Thornwood delegation finished speaking, he said only that he would consider the matter. Garrett was escorted to guest quarters. The hall emptied, and Magnus climbed the stairs to the gallery where Seraphina stood trembling, her hands white-knuckled on the stone railing. He asked only one question. Is what he says true? No. The word came out as a whisper. He left me to die because he fears what this child might become. Magnus's expression hardened into something that might have terrified her if she didn't know it was not directed at her. Good, he said. Now tell me everything. She told him in Marin's chambers, with Ronan and Cordelia as witnesses, finally speaking the truth she had carried for so long, Garrett's cruelty, his growing fear as signs emerged that the child might be gifted. The pack seer's prophecy that had sealed her fate. The child will bring its father's house to ruin or to glory, she repeated. Those were her exact words. Garrett decided he could not risk either outcome. He wanted me to give the baby to a temple in the mountains, claim it died in birth. When I refused, he chose a more permanent solution. Magnus's fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Ronan paced by the window, his weathered face grim. Cordelia sat still as stone, her eyes blazing. We cannot simply execute him, Ronan said. His father is allied with 3 other packs. It would start a war. Then we need proof, Magnus replied. Something his allies cannot dismiss. The seer, Seraphina said. She witnessed everything. She heard Garrett discuss his plans, but he had her imprisoned after the prophecy, locked away somewhere she could not repeat what she knew. Do you know where? Seraphina closed her eyes, reaching back through memory to maps she had glimpsed in Garrett's study. I can draw it. The old watchtower on the eastern border of Thornwood territory. He keeps prisoners there when he doesn't want anyone asking questions. She took parchment and quill, sketched the layout from memory, marked the approaches and guard positions she remembered. When she finished, Ronan took the map with something approaching wonder in his eyes. This is detailed, he said. You have a soldier's eye. I had 8 years with nothing to do but observe and remember, she replied. It was the only power I had. Magnus touched her shoulder, his hand warm through the fabric of her gown. You're not going with them, I know. She met his eyes. I'm too close to my time, but I can help plan. Let me do that much. He nodded, and she saw in his face something that looked very much like pride. The night before Ronan's team was set to ride, Seraphina could not sleep. The baby was restless, pressing against her ribs, and her mind would not quiet. She rose from her bed and paced the chamber, watching the fire burn low, counting the hours until dawn. A knock came at her door. Soft, hesitant. She knew who it was before she opened it. Magnus stood in the corridor, dressed simply in a linen shirt and dark trousers, his feet bare against the cold stone. He looked younger somehow, stripped of his armor and crown, just a man who could not find rest. I should not be here, he said. But you are. They talked through the closed door at first, neither willing to take the step of opening it. He told her he was afraid, not of Garrett or the coming confrontation, but of what happened after. If they survived this, if Garrett was defeated. What then? What do you want to happen? She asked. A long silence. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. I want to stop being alone. She opened the door. They talked for hours, sitting on opposite ends of her bed like children sharing secrets in the dark. He told her about Elena, really told her, not the sanitized version, but the raw truth of watching the woman he loved die in his arms. She told him about Garrett, about the years of small cruelties that had eroded her sense of worth, about the moment she realized she would rather die in a snowstorm than let him take her child. I never thought I would feel this way again, Magnus said. I'm not sure I should. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. I'm terrified of trusting anyone. I've been wrong before. Trusted the wrong person, nearly died for it. But I trust you. He lifted her hand to his lips. The kiss was gentle, barely a brush of warmth against her knuckles, but it sent heat racing through her. When he leaned in, she met him halfway, and their mouths came together with a tenderness that broke something open in her chest. He pulled back first. This isn't right, he said. The words seemed to cost him. You're still technically bound to him. I won't dishonor you. Garrett abandoned me. By pack law, the connection is broken. Then when he's dealt with. When you're free, and the child is safe. He stood, putting distance between them. We'll speak of this again. He left. Serafina pressed her fingers to her lips and found that she was smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. 3 days later, everything fell apart. Ronan's team had not returned. The Seer's tower had been empty when they arrived. The guards fled. No trace of the woman who could have condemned Garrett with her testimony. It was a trap, Ronan reported when he finally made it back, bloody and exhausted. He knew we were coming, had to fight our way out. Garrett was waiting in the great hall when Magnus went to confront him. Armed guards flanked him, more than he had brought, which meant someone in the castle had been feeding him information. His smile was the most honest thing about him, triumphant and cruel. The seer is dead, he said. I'm afraid there was an accident in her tower. No witnesses remain to contradict my account. And if the Alpha King continues to harbor my wife against my wishes, I will have no choice but to consider it an act of war. Serafina heard the confrontation from the healing wing where she was supposed to be hiding. She heard Garrett's smooth threats, Magnus's controlled fury, the murmur of nobles choosing sides. She pressed her hand to her belly, felt her daughter shift restlessly, and made a decision. She was done hiding. She was done being a piece in other people's games. If this was going to end, it would end, because she chose to end it. She walked into the great hall with her head held high, her cream gown stretched tight over her pregnant belly, and every eye turned to her. Garrett's composure cracked for just a moment, surprise flickering across his handsome face before he smoothed it away. My dear wife, he said, how touching that you've come to me at last. I've come to exercise my right under the ancient laws. Serafina's voice carried through the hall, clear and steady. The right of a wronged partner to call for judgment by combat. Silence. Then whispers, spreading like wildfire through the gathered crowd. You cannot be serious, Garrett said. He was still smiling, but it had gone brittle at the edges. You abandoned me to die. You tried to murder our child before she could draw breath. I call upon the Alpha King to act as my champion, and I demand that the old laws be honored. You cannot refuse without declaring yourself a coward before every pack represented here. Garrett's eyes darted to the ambassadors, the nobles, the witnesses who would carry this story across the realm. His trap had sprung closed, but not on the prey he had intended. Very well, he said. Let it be combat. Magnus caught her arm as the hall cleared for the duel. You should not have done that. You were going to lose, Serafina replied. He had allies, false testimony, political pressure. This way, there's no room for maneuvering. One fight. One outcome. No wars. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his eyes something that went beyond gratitude, beyond desire. into a territory she was not yet ready to name. "If I fall," he said, "you won't." But she gripped his hand anyway. "You can't. I didn't survive that storm just to watch you die in my place." He kissed her then, quick and hard, not caring who saw. Then he strode toward the courtyard where Garrett waited, and Seraphina followed to watch the man she loved fight for her life. The duel was brutal from the first moment. They shifted simultaneously, Garrett's brown wolf lean and quick against Magnus's massive black form, and launched at each other with the savagery of natural enemies. Blood splashed across the snow almost immediately, impossible to tell whose, and the watching crowd roared with bloodlust or fear. Garrett fought dirty. Dust kicked into eyes. Feints toward Seraphina that forced Magnus to break position. Every cheap trick in the arsenal of a man who had never learned to fight fair. Magnus took a wound protecting her, teeth raking across his flank, and for a terrible moment Seraphina thought he might fall. Then she saw it. The pattern she had learned over 8 years of surviving Garrett's cruelty. The weakness he had never bothered to correct because he had never faced anyone who might exploit it. "His right flank!" she shouted. "He can't guard it." Magnus adjusted. 3 more exchanges, each one driving Garrett back, and then a final lunge that sent the brown wolf crashing to the ground, with black jaws locked around his throat. Submit or die. Magnus's voice was barely human, more growl than words. Garrett submitted, exposed his throat, whimpered like the coward he had always been. Magnus held the killing grip for one long moment. Then he looked at Seraphina, waiting for her judgment. She shook her head. "Not death. Exile. Let him live with what he's lost, mercy where brutality was expected." The crowd's murmur shifted from bloodlust to something more complicated. Something like respect for the woman who had asked for her enemy's life to be spared. Garrett Thornwood was stripped of rank, pack, and territory. He was escorted beyond the borders of Magnus's kingdom with nothing but the clothes on his back and a warning that return meant death. His allies, watching the duel, chose not to protest. A man who lost in fair combat had no one to blame but himself. It was over. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it arrived, it transformed the world. Snow melted into rushing streams. Flowers burst from earth that had seemed barren. Birds returned to fill the air with song. And in the royal chambers of Castle Blackwood, a child's cry announced the arrival of a new life. Seraphina's daughter was born 2 weeks after the duel, healthy and strong, with her mother's violet eyes and a thatch of dark hair that might have been Magnus's if such a thing were possible. Marin delivered her with steady hands while Magnus paced the corridor outside, driving his guards to distraction with his barely contained anxiety. When they finally let him in, he stood at the foot of the bed and stared at the tiny bundle in Seraphina's arms, with an expression of such unguarded wonder that she had to look away or start crying. "She's perfect," he said. "She is." Seraphina stroked her daughter's cheek, marveling at the softness of new skin. "I've been calling her Elena, if that's all right." Magnus's breath caught. His eyes, when he raised them to hers, were suspiciously bright. "It's more than all right." He sat beside her on the bed, careful not to jostle either mother or child, and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They stayed that way for a long time, the 3 of them together, a family forged not by blood, but by choice. Ronan returned a month later with unexpected news. The seer had not died in her tower. She had escaped, fled to a neutral territory, and was willing to testify about Garrett's crimes before any court that asked. The exile would stand regardless, but now there was proof. Documentation. Truth that could not be disputed. The prophecy, too, had been a misunderstanding. The seer had meant the child would determine its father's legacy, not destroy him. Garrett, in his fear and paranoia, had heard threat where there was only possibility. "He destroyed himself," Seraphina said when Magnus told her. The prophecy was right. Just not the way he thought. Poetic justice, Magnus agreed. Though I could have done without nearly losing you to his cowardice. Summer arrived with warmth that reached even the highest mountain valleys. Magnus brought Seraphina to the east wing on an afternoon when sunlight flooded through windows that had been shuttered for 5 years. He had ordered it opened, aired out, made ready for life again. Elena's portrait hung in the main chamber. Seraphina looked at it for a long time, studying the face of the woman Magnus had loved before her. Elena had been beautiful, dark-haired and kind-eyed, with a smile that promised mischief. She would have liked you, Magnus said. She had a talent for seeing the best in people, and she would have seen it in you. I hope I would have liked her too. You would have. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I asked you once what I wanted to happen when Garrett was dealt with. I know the answer now. Seraphina's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. And what is that? He dropped to one knee before her, there in the room that had been his first wife's, and asked her to be his queen. She said yes. The wedding was held in autumn, when the leaves turned gold and the mountains blazed with color. Seraphina wore white silk embroidered with flowers from the winter garden, and little Elena sat in Cordelia's arms and watched with wide violet eyes as her mother pledged her life to the Alpha King. Ronan served as witness. Marin wept openly. The nobles and ambassadors who had once whispered about the mysterious pregnant stranger now bowed before their new queen. That night, alone in the chambers that were now hers as much as his, Magnus held Seraphina close and asked her the question that had been burning in his heart for months. Do you love me? She thought about the question longer than he expected, not because the answer was uncertain, but because she wanted to give it the weight it deserved. She thought about the years with Garrett, how quickly he had spoken words of affection and how hollow they had proven. She thought about her mother's advice, given so long ago it felt like another lifetime. Love is not a lightning bolt, child. It is a fire built stick by stick, breath by breath. It takes time to burn truly. She kissed him before answering, long and deep, saying with her body what words could never fully express. Then she pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. I love who you are, she said. Not the king, not the reputation. The man who reads poetry by firelight and kneels to speak to lost children and has spent 5 years punishing himself for a death he could not have prevented. I love that man. I will love him for as long as I draw breath. Magnus's eyes glistened in the candlelight, and for the first time since Elena's death, he did not try to hide it. I was so afraid, he admitted. Afraid that loving again would mean losing again. Afraid that I would fail you the way I failed her. Seraphina cupped his scarred face in her hands. You did not fail Elena. You loved her. And you lost her. And that is not the same thing. She would not want you to spend your life as a ghost. How do you know? Because I would not want that for you either. And if she loved you half as much as I do, she felt the same. He pulled her close, and they stayed that way as the candles burned low, 2 broken people who had somehow found the pieces they needed to become whole. I walked into that storm expecting to die, she said into the darkness. Instead, I found my way home. He understood. It was enough. It was everything. Outside, the first snow of the new winter began to fall, but inside the castle there was only warmth. And in the nursery down the hall, little Elena slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams newborns dream, unaware that she had been born into a world that had very nearly destroyed her mother, but had instead given her everything she had never dared to hope for. The prophecy had been right, in its way. The child had brought her father's house to ruin, just not the father anyone had expected. Garrett Thornwood wandered the borderlands alone, stripped of everything he had valued, while a daughter who bore none of his blood slept safely in a castle that would one day be hers to inherit. And Seraphina, who had walked into a storm with nothing but the child in her belly and the stubborn refusal to surrender, had found not just survival, but the kind of love that stories were written about. Some storms, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, were not endings at all. Some storms were simply the path to where you were always meant to be.